sure that people understand that there's these other pressures that exist for people. Because a lot of people understand, they hear about ISIS, and so they think these are conflict-based refugees. How many people know that 70% of livestock's been lost in the past 4 years in Syria? I mean, facts like that, I think, seriously will change people's opinions and minds with regards to migration and refugees in general, because British media is not very nice sometimes, is it? I think these facts will really help.
There's a double standard, isn't there, all the time, as we know, from the point of view of government, because as far as security is concerned, the refugee issue is top of the list. When I was at a talk just over a year ago, and it was Christina Figueres from the United Nations gave a talk in St Paul's Cathedral, and there were 3 other members on the panel with her. And one of them was a guy from Admiral somebody or other, and he was saying that, as far as he was concerned, that was the refugees as a result of climate change was the top of the security list. So the government kind of, from one point of view, it's very much on the top of their agenda.
Do people think is that a positive thing that governments respond to and say, yes, climate refugees is a security issue? Because there's a framing around that. People said, okay, it's good that at least they're talking about it. Is that positive, or is there problems with it?
Depends what their agenda is, doesn't it?
Depends what their agenda. So what do you think could be the problem? What are the positives about it? Let's think about the positives. Are there any positives around it?
That they're acknowledging that it's a thing.
So the fact that people are acknowledging that actually there is a crisis is positive. Any other positive?
Well, that's something we do quite a lot, and I think quite rightly, is to say, when we're talking to people about climate change, these big, powerful organisations that are acknowledging the problem, and that's the fact that, for example, NATO is acknowledging refugee issues as a security issue is kind of related to the World Bank recognising the problem of climate change, or insurance people, or whatever it is, PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's acknowledgement that these people who are not the usual suspects recognise this is something to be responded to one way or another.
Just sort of a similar thing to that. It's a way of highlighting the issue in a different way that is probably going to push it up some people's agenda when they probably wouldn't care about it beforehand. So that's a positive from it.
There's a lot of people who say there's a lot of worry about that the positive is outweighed by the negative. Because we start talking about climate or refugees as a security issue, the response becomes like a security response. So the security response is how do we protect our borders? How do we build fences? How do we prevent this wave of migration happening? So do we then reinforce that we have no agency with the issue, this is happening and we have to just deal with its impacts? Do you think that makes our fight harder then? You said it was a positive thing. So.
Yeah, because I think, well, at least if it's being talked about, then the discussion is open. I would hope to think that there would be enough people who would oppose, we can't just close our borders. You need all of you need the facts and the figures and stuff for people to know that it opens the discussion so someone can oppose it. But if it's not open at all, then no one talks about it, but no one opposes it either. So you're in a bit of a stagnant situation.
If it's on their agenda but it's discussed in private, then the public has no input and no way to. And we all know that sometimes political agendas don't really tie in with what the wider public want and what morally as well what we should be doing. So if it's on their list of things, but it's not discussed in public and people aren't privy to the conversations that are being had, it's not really democratic.
The thing I went to was a public thing, obviously, and the chap who was speaking was actually a retired person. But obviously on that occasion he was using that as an argument about the necessity, the urgency of addressing climate change on that occasion.
Yeah, I think if it's framed as a security issue, it has to be framed as a long-term security issue, If you talk about it as a one-time Syrian migrant event, then it becomes more of a, what are we going to do about this straight away? We need to build fences, we need to do this. But if it's looked at long-term, and you can plan security issues as a long-term, it's not done commonly by governments, but if it's a long-term issue, then maybe they start to take action to mitigate the effects rather than planning to.
We had a point earlier saying we had so last year 3,500 people drowned in the Mediterranean. This year that number will be surpassed. We had countless bodies washed up in Greece, Italy, etc. And the dominant narrative, at least from governments, was what from the EU was what it was a discussion over to do. What it was, we shouldn't have rescue boats because it encourages people. We should bomb smugglers' boats in Libya to prevent people from being able to get onto the Mediterranean. We should ask the military dictatorship in Egypt to police its borders more strongly and prevent people smuggling. So, is there that? And that was quite a very public discussion, wasn't it? Pictures, discussion. Do you think it's possible to change that to a positive way if we talk about climate?
As long as the media doesn't always lead the conversation, then yeah. So I think that's maybe one of the problems there. You talk about that mass migration over the Mediterranean. Yet again, it's dealing with the effect, not the cause of the problem.
Actually, I'm not being funny, but I took that to mean we don't want people drowning in the Mediterranean. Like, we should be going and either helping them come over. Like, the point being that we don't want people smugglers killing people in the Mediterranean. So I took that to be not an entirely negative thing. Like, that we're saying we don't want people crossing the Mediterranean, we want to either go in and help them ourselves. Nowadays they're saying let's put rescue boats in. But I think when it first started, you were thinking, well, this can't happen to people. So you do need to look at how you help people to do something. But at the same time, you don't want bad things happening to people. So you want to stop something. And that's an odd thing to do, but you do need to.
It was never part of the strategy, though, was it? There in that particular system, they took a lot of funds away from. I can't remember what the firm.
The rescue
boats, and they put a lot of stress on the Italian Coast Guard.
That was a very poor.
There was no, and objectively, when almost anyone from society looks at that, they can see that they were never there to really help them. It was to stop people coming over. It seems like that decision wasn't taken to stop people drowning. It was to stop people coming over, and not thinking, do we have to go over there and help them? That's the way that I perceived it.
Yeah.
That's how I would perceive it.
I was in Italy at the time, you see, and I think, and it was eventually read as that, but the first thing that I remember reading was that they're trying to stop this from happening. But then my Italian's not perfect, so it may just be that I was reading the press and thought, oh, well, that's good, they're going to stop that. And then people went out and did it themselves. People went out and worked themselves, and that's how it changed. So the public sway just changed as we were doing it. I'm not sure.
I'm wondering if it's a bit optimistic, but there's an opportunity to rethink Europe. Partly after the Jeremy Corbyn victory, and things are sort of a bit more open, aren't they, about the kind of Britain we want. There's stuff in The Guardian last Saturday which was about that. It was writers reflected on the refugee crisis. There were some really very moving things about what Europe could look like, welcoming, multicultural, and saying things like nationalism is just organised selfishness, which I thought was brilliant. So the whole idea of just keep them out, or the fact that we're blaming Hungary now, rather than actually saying, okay, we'll do something systematic and take in. We worked out Sheffield. If we had the same as this, just for Syrian refugees, if we had the same as Germany, Sheffield would be hosting 8,000 Syrian refugees. So there's something about just this whole refugee crisis now that can open up an idea of what a fair and sustainable and compassionate Europe will look like. And that links to me very much to, and here we are, burning up the fossil fuels and the southern hemisphere countries or other countries suffering. How can we need to act. We need to act to mitigate most of that, but also knowing that we're needing to be a much more open and welcoming country. Is that too optimistic?
Is that too optimistic?
Well, I think it's hard for people to have the empathy because especially in Britain, we see a lot of people see climate change as something that happens somewhere else, and like with the Syrian refugees recently, it took that picture of the boy on the beach for people to really change their opinion, for the newspapers to change their opinion, to get the empathy from people. Like, it's getting those stories across now about what's happening. I mean, that's what we're doing in Sheffield Climate Lines at the moment. We're doing a project called Climate Stories, getting people from around Sheffield to talk about their experiences across the world, the relatives they have, and what the experience they're having with climate, to try and bring that empathy to allow people to make that leap and change, and rather than seeing it as it happens somewhere else and it's not our problem, is to get that empathy that brings people together and makes it a change in their sort of viewpoint of the refugees, especially on a climate basis.
But surely it's not just about the viewpoint about refugees, it's the Western lifestyle that's driving the climate change in the first place. And if all we do is, in our name, governments do, is the security response or the welcome response, I mean, it's still not tackling the drivers of climate change.
And that, I think, is an issue, isn't it? Because if we look at the reality of all refugees, whether they're environmental or political refugees, etc., it tends to be the wealthiest element, or a very, very small proportion of the refugee community that ever makes it to Europe in the first place. So the majority of refugees, of course, are internally displaced or are in neighbouring countries. So, is it? I think this is the big thorny. I mean, it's a question about when you talk about climate refugees. Are we talking about climate refugees in the sense of the story of somebody coming and being able to humanise it and tell a human story? Because I think we all accept that one of the difficulties of climate change has been it's been a bit geeky. It's been about these things that would happen, and didn't really talk about people. People were empty when people talk about climate change, and people still empty. I mean, people still prefer to put a picture of a polar bear on an ice cap than talk about a person. I mean, and it's the go-to picture, isn't it, when you talk about climate change, rather than. And is that because there is a fear about the lack of empathy, or
because it's not political, isn't it? Like polar bears isn't politicised, and
people like cute cuddly bears.
Yeah.
No, isn't it just more scary if you put a person on there, because that's going to be you in 20 years.
Yeah,
so actually it's much, much more worrying as soon as you stick anybody, and I don't agree with Emma Thompson. I don't agree that it's what colour people are. I think people just go, oh my god, that's me in 30 years, that's horrible. And I actually think it's a little bit easier to cope with seeing a polar bear lose his home, because he can swim. Whereas watching people having to get across borders and everything else is bloody horrible. And I actually think, no, it's just too much to bear. It's not, I don't think it is to do with, I think actually it's much easier for people to cope with things which are to do with butterflies dying out and polar bears having to swim than thinking that that's me.
Society's all too willing to sweep those problems under the carpet, aren't they? That's why they like the polar bear image, because it doesn't address the real issue, and it doesn't.
It's not as horrible, I think, is actually the reality of it. And that's and I think that the more horrible the thing, the less easy it is to talk about. So I think that's possibly why we don't do it. And I think flim-flamming around whether it's racism or saying, oh, we'll take 80,000, it's just being a little bit it is just flim-flam, because I don't think that that's very important. What is important is saying what are we going to do in order to try and stop this happening. And so all of it's a bit...
Let me pose a question to you. So if you look at what the IPCC said, they said, if there's a carbon budget, right, for what's out there, if you want to prevent 1.5 degrees, a breach of the 1.5, they said that's about 6 years. So if you want to prevent 2 degrees, it's about 15 years. That's out there. And they said, well, and here are the impacts if it happens with 1.5 or 2 degrees, and we see all these impacts that are happening. This is all happening at 0.8 degrees warming, all the things we're seeing around the world. So we have, let's say, we're the generation that can do something about this, that we're able to do. Because after that, we'll be just dealing with impact. So, what is it? What will it take? So, you know, is it a cop-out not to put people, even if it's the scary and the horrible thing? Because is that the reality, or have we? You know, what have we learned over 30 years of climate campaigning? Have we learned anything about climate campaigning that says that this is the right way we should be doing it, or the wrong way that we should be doing it? Tim?
I'm not quite sure whether your point was that a picture of a person wouldn't work or gain traction with people.
No,
or
I think
whether
it's
you
more
thought it
scary.
would work. Right. Because I think my personal view is that people's track record of responding to horrible images positively is quite good. If you think about, for example, Michael Burke's reporting from Ethiopia in 1984, it's because, in my opinion, humans respond to things that are immediate and are happening now, and not necessarily things that are either long-term or part of a trend, but which are intermittent. Like, we're going to have lots of difficult winter floods, but we're not going to have them every year, are we? And so there'll be this, oh yeah. As someone said earlier today, I think Suzanne said, the percentage of people who are concerned about climate impacts goes up if you look at the people who are living in areas that have had flooding. So for me personally, I mean, no one has the answer to this, otherwise we wouldn't be in this mess. But for me personally, one of the issues is not to do with people's lack of response to the human image or the human impacts. It's the response to things that are part of a wider trend and not necessarily entirely predictable.
I mean, climate change and climate science has just struggled, even over the past 30 years, just with garnishing proper support. Just, I mean, denial of climate change has set back climate change action years and years and years, and it still exists. It's still, you know, we have to have a conference where, you know, people with very similar mindsets come and sit together to discuss this, and, you know, what is the wider impact of it? Yeah, it's growing, and that's probably evident across all the refugee stuff as well. People don't understand about refugees coming from a place where the climate is so deeply affected. I mean, Britain's got one of the most mild. We whinge and moan about the weather all the time, but it's actually pretty damn good.
Simple question. China, when we think about the Himalayas, think about all that water pushing them into Bangladesh, because we've got imperialists in India always look at the Himalayas from the south, don't we? China, yeah, on the north side of the Himalayas, they're also getting floods. My simple question is, how much movement of bodies is that within China as a result of the flooding caused by glaciers melting?
So this is a worldwide phenomenon of people moving from rural to big urban cities, and there are a number of different reasons for this. Of course, people see subsistence living, see the attraction of city. I'm from Burnley. I live in London. You know, when I was 8, okay, I don't want to live in this little town. Much as I love it, I don't want to. There's always this attraction of actually going somewhere else and doing. So there are complex, but one of the reasons why you have seen a shift in rural populations is because you know, and the Horn of Africa is a very, very good example of this, where people are shifting because subsistence farming is no longer possible, and then where do they go? They could move towards cities, and they move towards cities. The cities expand, slums expand, blah blah blah, and you get bigger and bigger cities. Now, some people argue that's really positive. That we should look at that, and we should look for the positives in that, because then you'll have bigger cities. People's footprints can be more managed. You can, if you think creatively, you can do all this thing, blah blah blah. But actually, there's a shift. And in China, when you look at what the Chinese government is discussing, for China, climate change is one of its biggest priorities to tackle because of its own security internally. Because they've made an agreement generally with their people, which was, you're in abject poverty, we'll lift you out of abject poverty, and you limit your civil and political rights, and we'll give you economic benefit. And most people have said, okay, you know, for a long time, that was all right, that's a fair deal, I was in abject poverty. So in the last 2-3 decades, they've lifted 400 million people out of poverty, absolute poverty. 300 million people are still in poverty, and they said that's our priority. And at the same time, they also recognise desertification, pollution, impacts on water, on agriculture, on food, and they recognise that these are the upheavals that could challenge the political order in China. The collapse of agriculture and rice in the Mekong all would have a ripple out effect, and we saw it just by one harvest went by, and suddenly all rice producing countries stopped any export of rice out of their country, and it all had. Now you look at China, United Arab Emirates, all looking at Africa and saying, can we lease land in Africa to grow food, to maintain our own food security? So this is the problem of like the security narrative. It does drive action, but does it only drive a particular form of action, which is how do we protect ourselves from this oncoming impact, rather than how are we dealing with the drivers of what's actually coming? And so there's a question about both the security impact, and Tim, you talked about the Ethiopia and the pictures of the starving child in Africa, and it was probably was remember there was Chumbawamba's record saying pictures of starving children sell records, but actually there was a lot of discussion amongst development groups after that, and they agreed not to use pictures of starving children, because they said what happened was you get a huge amount of people responding immediately, giving you donations, but then you reinforce their frame, which says Africa is a continent of just hunger, and there's nothing really I can do about it. It's not my fault. They just starve there, and so you have a moment of empathy, and then it comes crashing down.
It's problematic the same way as the responses to climate.
Exactly. Do we respond humanly on one level, but then absolve ourselves of responsibility of actually changing our patterns of behaviour? And that's, I think, the big doubt.
Yeah, I think there has been sort of climate activism, a change from the negatives to the positives. What the benefits will be for you, for your family, you'll have reduced bills, you'll have more work, etc. That's the sort of messages we're giving out now. I think that's the same thing with refugees, is there's been a lot of negatives, and we need to find sort of the positives and what benefits there will be to make change.
I was thinking that as well. It's I think people are generally feeling really anxious about it, the general populace. So if the environment movement can sort of give people something positive to do, and we need to get to the root cause of this. And I know Craig Bennett did that article in The Guardian, and that's the first time I've seen it properly linked, so it's actually people are really desperate to do something, and I mean obviously helping people and welcoming, but also getting to the root cause. So this could be a time or an opportunity to kind of get the message out, but make it positive, we can do something. I don't know.
No, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can hear people, so I think I might have to come back in. I think you're absolutely right. I think there are two main things. First of all, one of the big problems of the climate movement, and there are many problems with the climate movement, one of its big problems was it talked about misery, and it did talk about vision. It didn't talk about that we have solutions, that we can actually feed the world 3 times over with agroecology that cools the planet. We can actually tackle the climate crisis and create a more equal, better world. So the vision of a positive world, that was more than what we were, more than bills, but actually something that people could believe in, I think has been largely lacking. And that has really weakened us as a movement, because you can always get people to come out on the street for a no, but to sustain people, you need a yes. People need to buy into what is it you're telling me to do. And all great movements that have transformed the world have all had a very, very positive yes. They've had a vision of the world they want, and we have not really talked about the vision of the world we want. And I think that vision of the world can't be based on security, and it can't be based on the fear, but it has to be a much deeper, because the one thing I do draw is that the people have got an incredible amount of empathy, but it's how you connect with that empathy and where you take that empathy. If you only allow that empathy to be about give a small donation to this moment, I think we miss the We miss it. And so we have to really think about that these crises are coming again and again and again, and how are we building our underlying narrative constantly through that to tell the story about justice and people and food and energy. I think that's the only way we begin to do it. And the only way is we also bring those movements of people into the climate movement as well, because I think that's also, of course, a big issue we all face. We talked about what you're saying. Our big fight for many years was about climate denial, which was always also a question about power, wasn't it? We weren't powerful enough. They're much more powerful, so they locked us into a fight for 20 years about, is climate change real? You know, rather than allowing us to go out of that fight and bring new people in. We were always consistently talking about, no, it's really real. Look at these reports. That was perfect, because it made us talk to a very, very small number of people in a circular argument, rather than actually looking out and saying who are the other kind of people who should be part of this conversation.
I've been asked to remind you to do some headlines to bring back to the plenary.
I don't think there is a headline. Well, I don't know. So maybe somebody else would. Somebody else. So okay, what are the 3 points then we want to say? Okay, 3 points, go on, let's do this collectively. So Heather, you can write them.
I think what you just said about vision and saying yes.
We need a positive vision.
I think it's from the People Climate March, the slogan, to change everything, we need everyone. So quite like, but this kind of speaks to the need of bringing together different movements and people from all kind of backgrounds. But yeah, so.
So what would the second point be?
We need an inclusive narrative
Yeah.
of movement, of the movement. Maybe inclusive narrative and demands to build movement.
And I think for that one, it's about something you have something to offer, because it's about telling people what they can do. There's lots of people feel totally unable to offer, not able to be an activist, for example, not able to sign all these online petitions because they're overwhelmed. So it's thinking about what they can do. So it's each person has a role. I don't quite know how we put that.
So give people agency and give them windows of opportunity that they can engage. So lots of different things that people can do.
Because actually I find that really off-putting. We need everyone, because I feel there's always pressure to get my friends and family involved, and they're really on board, but they don't want to come today, and that's their choice. So it's like finding things they can do that's right for them.
There's a separate argument about that slogan. There is a separate where people say, actually it's not right, it's not true. We don't need everyone. We don't need everyone. Because do you need corporations? Do you need businesses and elites? Do you need all those? Who does it need? It needs us. Who's us? How many people do? And there's a lot of thinking about it. You need 15% of the population to be active about something. They drive it. That the idea that we needed 100% people behind something before it can change. Because that will also undermine what we're saying.
A critical mass.
A critical mass.
And there's always that tipping point.
Yeah, what is it? People say that's between 10-15% of the population, gives you a tipping point, which gives you another 20-25% people who then follow that, and that's enough to transform any society about any issue that you want.
So we'll do some fake fear mongering as well. If we don't act now, there'll be 3 billion refugees by 2050.
My fear, I always say, is the problem with the fake fear mongering is people will say, yeah, that's true, let's do what the Hungarians are doing. Electrify the fences bigger, put machine guns on there.
Well, that's kind of what the UK has done already in Calais, isn't it? But very politely.
On the French side.
So give people more agency. We also talked about more human empathy, wasn't there? So the importance of human stories and empathy to tell our story.
Important about maintaining that empathy. So that does link to that, doesn't it?
And do we need to do more in our own internal movement to make people understand the link between climate and refugees, and why people are created as refugees, and our responsibility to that?
Education.
It's also about making people more realistic about what will be needed, because I think part of this refugee crisis is that everybody's been taken on the back foot instead of saying these people are going to be displaced. So how do we deal with it humanely and in a, you know, it's a realistic thing that's going to happen. So it's changing those mindsets as opposed to wait till it's a crisis and then we'll all panic.
Sure. There's a study done in the US which identified that for every 0.1 degree warming, it created 100,000 migrants to cross the border into the US. And people thought that would be a really powerful thing to get US administration saying why you must tackle climate change because look at that. And the response was, that's really important. Let's build a fence.
Yeah.
So there is some things. So maybe it's also about who are the decision makers. You know, how we ultimately, I think, it is about who is making these decisions and how we were able to change the broader politics as well for this.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's why you need a proper international effort to do things. You mentioned China investing in land in Africa to sustain their things, and seeing it as a security issue. But that's because even if they invested billions, trillions, and became carbon neutral overnight as a country, they see India next door, who have a rapidly expanding population, building more coal power plants. The same in Southeast Asia with these rapidly emerging. So they know that if they invest by themselves in renewable energies, they're still going to have the impact of climate change anyway. That's why it has to be an international effort.
Absolutely, look, it has to be a global effort, and there are lots of maybe misunderstood stuff about developing countries. I mean, developing countries actually at the moment are doing more to reduce emissions than developed countries, even though developed countries have a greater responsibility. You know, how do we say to China, yes, there's always that one figure. You know, China's building a power station every week, one power station, but actually it's decommissioning 3 at the same time. Yeah. So, but it's very, very difficult in the rest of the world to say anything when our own government is, doing its best to trash the solar industry, gung-ho on fracking, saying exploit every drop of oil in the North Sea, let's start deep coal mining again. How does anybody else there look at it and say, well, excuse me, but I'm dealing with 2 issues. I'm dealing with not only the climate impact, but I'm also dealing with poverty issues, and my population is telling me, why don't I have a school, a house, a home?
It's always that difficult. As developed nations, it is really difficult to say to other nations in the world, we've been through our industrialisation, we've made them mistakes, and you're not allowed to do that, and you're not allowed to do this. And that's a really difficult discussion to have, because if we're not willing to put money and technology aside to help all the other nations to develop to where we are in a quicker rate, then they have to go through the industrialisation process. They have to go through fossil fuels, because that's the only way that human development knows how to get to the points where, inevitably we feel like we have to be.
Which is why we talk about climate change as a crisis for crisis, because if you want to look at the reasons why people will move, in Ethiopia was a classic example. There we talk about the famine in Ethiopia. At the same time as the famine in Ethiopia, Ethiopia was exporting huge amounts of food because of the trade deals and because of corporations. We talk about we had a workshop, I think, this morning about TTIP. It's how we creating trade agreements which will impoverish people at the same time and then drive them to be migrants, and then say, but these are economic migrants, because people are saying they're leaving. And it draws in a deeper question, will we have empathy for somebody who's hit by a hurricane and say yes, but will we not have empathy for somebody who says, but I'm about to starve because my harvest has just collapsed, and say, but that's economic, because now you're leaving for economic reasons and not because of natural. So I think there's also a deeper question in terms of how we define what is a climate refugee, and that we don't fall into the thing of, when we're talking about climate refugee, from the idea of big natural disasters and environmental disasters.
I think it's a similar mechanism to the refugee crisis we see now. I mean, there are millions of people fleeing Syria, and Hungary sees that by itself and says, we can't take 3 million, 4 million, 5 million people, so we should build a fence. Whereas if it was a collective European-wide effort saying we'll each take them, they wouldn't be building a fence. It wouldn't be a security issue, it would be a humanitarian response. And the same applies to the international scale for climate change.
Ultimately, the climate change is a problem of the global commons. And for the global commons, you need a global resolution. Absolutely. It's why you need equity. It needs to be a fair agreement. Everybody needs to say, this is the problem, here's my responsibility to it, and I'm going to do my fair share. If somebody doesn't do their fair share, the whole idea of it falls, because everybody says, well, if you're not doing your fair share, why should I do my fair share? And unfortunately, that's the dynamic that we're seeing in the negotiations. It is, rather than more regulation, it's a deregulation of a system. And yeah, I think we were meant to finish at 3, quarter past 3. So thank you very much.